Okay, so we are going to start with our first lecture for early days, which is a module for Art History 1. Okay, so, well, why isn't this moving? There we go. Okay, here's the thing. People have been making art since before we were technically even people. Art making practices date back to the predecessors of Homo sapiens. You and I are Homo sapiens. So we have many tens of thousands of years of art history to cover in this class. It is impossible to cover everything, so we're going to start by doing kind of a breeze through in this first unit on the Paleolithic and go through some of the highlights of prehistoric art history. We're specifically going to look at work from the Paleolithic and the Neolithic periods in Africa, Europe, Asia, and South America. Then we're going to look at works from some very early civilizations in the Near East. And after this lecture, our topics are going to be a little bit more specific and not quite so widespread. But right now, we're just going to try to cover our bases, and when it comes to the dawn of civilization and the emergence of art, we just want to get a nice introduction going. Even here in Missouri, where you and I live, we have a history of Paleolithic art. There was a bone fragment with an engraving on this bone fragment with an engraving of basically a furry rhinoceros, an Ice Age rhinoceros, was found in Jacob's Cave near Sedalia, Missouri in the 1870s. This fragment has been dated all the way back to the Pleistocene by some scholars. So, after this lecture, the next time you're in Sedalia, stop by Jacob's Cave and walk the same path as your prehistoric artist ancestors. Okay, so we're going to start off in Africa. This particular image comes from smarthistory.org. So let's talk first about the word Paleolithic. So this is talking about the time period that we're in at the beginning of this lecture. If we break down the word, which is Greek in origin, it means old stone. Paleo meaning old, lithic meaning stone. So the Neolithic means new stone. Neo meaning new, lithic meaning stone. About 25,000 years ago, in a rock shelter in the Huns Mountains of Namibia, which is on the southwest coast of Africa, a distant relative of ours grabbed a piece of charcoal from the remains of an extinguished fire and started making marks on a slab of quartzite. The result was this, a rough drawing of an animal. The name of this cave site in the present day, Richardsfeld Trans-Frontier Park, is Apollo 11. Does Apollo 11 ring any bells for you? Any NASA fans in the house? Any fans of space exploration? The name Apollo 11 is not a coincidental name. This stone slab and several others like it were left behind by early people and subsequently buried under layers of dirt on the cave floor. Then in 1969, as he listened on his radio to the announcement that NASA's Apollo 11 mission to the moon had been a success, German archaeologist W.E. Wendt discovered the first fragment of these drawings. Although older sites have been found, for example, in 2008, there was a cave called Blumbos that's discovered that's a little older. These drawings are the earliest figurative drawings found on the African continent, which is pretty awesome. And they're named after this great other achievement of man, the Apollo 11 mission. Okay. Let's look at something else. So this sculpture is a Paleolithic example of the modern concept of ready-mades. So if you take Art History 2 with me, we'll learn about a guy named Marcel Duchamp. And he's an important 20th century figure who is credited with inventing this technique, which is called ready-mades. The Makapansgat pebble, which is what we're looking at here, which is also called the pebble of many faces, is described succinctly as an unmodified natural pebble of jasperite. So jasperite is the stone. It may not look like much to our eyes, but the hypothesis is that it must have been interesting to our distant ancestors because it was found at a site in South Africa, part of the cradle of humankind, which is like just north of Johannesburg, where jasperite is not otherwise found. So, an ancient prehistoric artist, not ancient, prehistoric, even older than ancient, saw this pebble, recognized that it resembled a face, and then they selected it and moved it with them as they traveled. The selection of an object is what designates a ready-made. So you don't carve the sculpture, you just pick up something and say, this is art, this is significant, and I'm taking it with me to another location. And that designates it as art. This is an extremely advanced conceptual art form, but it's rooted in a very basic human instinct in this case. We like things that look like us as humans. Babies' first thing that they tend to recognize are human faces. So this is a very deep in our lizard brain kind of thing. The small rock unmistakably resembles a face with 2 gaping eye sockets and an indent that could be a mouth. So it's sort of almost like a Stone Age emoji, if you will. It can also be flipped to see another kind of face. In his 2010 documentary about the Chauvet caves and their enigmatic images, Werner Herzog intones in his raspy, distinctive way, "It is if the modern soul had awakened here." That's a common sentiment, and clearly the kind of image making found in rock art is decisively important for the history of consciousness. But the murals at Chauvet, the subject of Werner Herzog's Cave of Forgotten Dreams, among the oldest painted images we know, are thought to be 30,000 to 32,000 years old. The Makapanesgat pebble is more like 2.5 to 3 million years old, depending on whom you ask. So we have millions of years of art history to consider. Okay, so what are these? Don't look at the caption. What do you think they might be? Okay, I'll put you out of your misery and tell you. They are fragments of very, very old ostrich eggs. Why might ancient people have kept ostrich eggs? Well, for bowls, for vessels, for goblets, for something to eat or drink out of, for something to mix other pigments in. Ready-made containers that already exist in the form of these giant eggs that come from ostriches. Now look more closely at these. What do you see? Markings. Intentional markings made by people. In 2010, archaeologists unearthed 270 pieces of engraved ostrich eggs dated to around 60,000 years ago from a site called Diepkloof in South Africa's Western Cape province. The fragments constitute what the researchers say is the earliest evidence of a graphic tradition among prehistoric hunter-gatherer populations. As such, this find helps us to illuminate the emergence of symbolic representation, which is a hallmark of modern human behavior. Now, what do you think the purpose of these marks is? Maybe it's early language. Maybe it's the designation, marking it as belonging to someone. This is Ooga Booga's lunch, do not take it, perhaps. Maybe. We don't know for sure. The most popular assessment by scholars is that these are purely decorative marks. And if that's the case, if there's no actual function, they're just art for art's sake, that would make these the very earliest purely abstract art ever found, and kind of rewrites the history of the cognitive development of appreciation of abstract form. We tend to think of abstraction as a modern invention, right? Like a late 19th century, early 20th century invention. If you take art history too, we'll talk about Helmut af Klint and Vasily Kandinsky, who are kind of the earliest modernist painters. We certainly think of graphic design as a modern concept, right? But as we see here, that's likely not the case. This has actually been around for a very, very long time. Okay, so that's our introduction. We're going to start off just with that little snippet looking at Paleolithic art in Africa. Next, we'll talk about Paleolithic art in South America.